In the quiet heartland of America in the 1970s, the annual grain harvest was not just an agricultural event. It was an economic triumph, a massive, mechanized process that moved with the precision of a well-oiled machine. It was driven by millions of independent farmers, each a small capitalist, making decisions based on global market prices, weather patterns, and the relentless pursuit of profit. This system was highly efficient, constantly innovating, and resulted in a perpetual, massive surplus of grain, enough not only to feed the United States with unparalleled variety and low cost, but enough to become the world's primary food exporter, establishing American agricultural dominance as a silent, powerful form of soft power. This annual abundance was taken for granted, a guarantee of food security built on the foundation of private property and market competition across the Atlantic. The Soviet harvest was an annual crisis, a massive, centralized mobilization effort fraught with anxiety, waste, and systemic failure. It was driven by the Kolkhoz collective farm and Sovkhoz state farm systems, enormous, bureaucratic entities whose goal was not to maximize yield or quality, but to meet the quota handed down by planners in Moscow. The entire process was defined by inefficiency, massive waste, and a persistent, chronic shortage that plagued the dinner tables of Soviet citizens for decades. This fundamental difference, abundance built on freedom versus scarcity built on control, tells the most humiliating story of the Cold War, the story of how the greatest land empire on Earth could not feed its own people. And if you stay until the end, you will learn the shocking true scale of the Great Grain Robbery, the secret deal that saved the Soviet Union from mass starvation. The core ideological difference lay in ownership and incentive. The American farmer owned the land, the equipment, and the output. The profit motive was direct and immediate. If a farmer worked smarter, invested in better machinery, and produced a higher quality or larger yield, the financial reward was entirely theirs. This fueled rapid adoption of new technologies, scientific farming methods, and constant, aggressive efficiency, transforming the U.S. into the breadbasket of the world. This direct link between effort and reward was the engine of the American agricultural miracle. The Soviet system was built on the abolition of private ownership. The collective farm was ostensibly owned by the workers, but was in reality rigidly controlled by the party. The individual farmer was paid a fixed, low wage or a token share of the harvest, regardless of their personal effort or the farm's actual output. The incentive to work hard, to innovate, or to minimize waste was virtually non-existent. Why should a farmer work tirelessly when the grain he produces goes to the state, and his reward remains the same? This led to endemic apathy, corruption, and sabotage on the state farms. Machinery was poorly maintained, planting was done carelessly, and harvest efforts were disorganized. Massive amounts of grain were left to rot in the fields or spoiled due to inadequate storage and transport. The Soviet farmer was effectively a state employee, lacking both the freedom and the financial incentive to succeed. The American system was fueled by the farmer's ambition. The Soviet system was crippled by the farmer's resentment and alienation, a contrast that directly translated from the vast fertile fields to the meager contents of the gastronome shelf. The technological gap between the two agricultural giants was vast and constantly widening. The American farming sector was a world leader in mechanization, irrigation, and chemical innovation. Modern combines, advanced tractors, and powerful fertilizers were constantly being developed by private industry and bought by farmers eager to maximize their yield. The agricultural process was streamlined, utilizing advanced science to ensure predictable, massive harvests regardless of minor weather fluctuations. The Soviet agricultural sector lagged decades behind, suffering from chronic underinvestment and relying on outdated, poorly maintained, often unreliable machinery. Soviet factories prioritized military and heavy industry production, meaning agriculture received the lowest quality equipment and minimal resource allocation. The state's inability to produce sufficient reliable tractors, combines, and chemical fertilizers meant that harvest time was a massive, chaotic logistical crisis, relying heavily on mobilized urban workers, students, and soldiers who lacked agricultural training to manually save the crop. This reliance on brute force and forced labor, instead of efficiency and technology, was a constant drag on productivity. The American farmer managed a massive acreage with a small, skilled crew and cutting-edge machinery. The Soviet farm required an army of mobilized, resentful people and unreliable equipment to manage the same output. The systemic focus on heavy industry meant the Soviet population was fed, in large part, by hand, not by science, a massive technological contradiction that humiliated the superpower on the world stage. The devastating paradox of the private plot was the ultimate indictment of the collective farm system. Even at the height of ideological control, the Soviet state grudgingly allowed collective farmers and urban workers to maintain tiny, personal garden plots. These small plots, often just half an acre, were intended as supplements to the state distribution system. But they quickly became the most productive segment of Soviet agriculture, occupying a minuscule fraction, around 3 to 5% of the USSR's arable land. These private plots consistently produced a staggering percentage of the country's food supply, often generating 30% of the total meat, milk, eggs, and vegetables. This was a shocking statistical failure, proving that a tiny fraction of the land, managed by private incentive and direct ownership, was vastly more efficient than the colossal, state-run collective system. The Soviet farmer, who deliberately worked slowly and apathetically on the Kolkhoz land, would then work tirelessly, efficiently, and innovatively on his own small plot. This proved beyond any political doubt that private property and direct economic incentive were the keys to agricultural success. The state system was a failure of logic. The small private plot was a triumph of basic human nature. The American farmer's entire massive operation was a version of the private plot. Utilizing the same incentive system, the Soviet economy was structurally reliant on this small, grudgingly permitted element of capitalism within its socialist framework, a hidden truth that revealed the collective farm as a mechanism of political control, not economic efficiency. The planning and quota system ensured perpetual scarcity. The Soviet agricultural process was dictated by Gosplan, the state planning committee, in Moscow, who issued rigid quotas on what to plant, how much to harvest, and where to send the produce. These quotas were often politically motivated, based on achieving impressive numerical targets for propaganda purposes, rather than based on local soil conditions, weather, or genuine consumer demand. This led to massive ecological damage, with farms forced to plant unsuitable crops or overwork the land to meet the arbitrary political goals. The managers of the collective farms often engaged in statistical fraud, reporting inflated figures to satisfy the central planners, creating a fictitious abundance on paper that evaporated into deficit at the consumer level. The American farmer, by contrast, planted what the market dictated, guided by futures contracts and commodity prices, a dynamic system that adjusted instantly to supply and demand, ensuring that market signals led to appropriate production levels. The Soviet system was a command economy that prioritized the stability of the bureaucracy over the nourishment of the population. The result was a chronic gap between production and need. The ultimate consequence of this planning failure was the massive need for grain imports, beginning most famously with the Great Grain Deal in 1972, a secret, humiliating agreement where the Soviet Union had to purchase vast quantities of American wheat and corn, using scarce hard currency, dollars, simply to avoid an outright food crisis. The superpower that boasted of feeding the world was secretly dependent on its capitalist enemy for its daily bread, a contradiction that the state went to extraordinary lengths to conceal. The sheer scale of waste and loss in the Soviet agricultural supply chain was a hidden economic disaster, a catastrophic inefficiency that the American system, driven by cost-saving and profit, had long eliminated. In the U.S., the journey from the farm to the supermarket shelf was ruthlessly optimized, utilizing advanced, refrigerated transport, dedicated infrastructure, and efficient storage silos. The goal was near-zero loss, ensuring that every harvested dollar's worth of grain and produce made it to the consumer. The The Soviet supply chain was a labyrinth of systemic failures. From the moment the grain was harvested, it began to spoil. Large quantities of grain rotted in the fields or were destroyed due to inadequate open-air storage facilities, often sitting exposed to moisture and pests while awaiting transport. The roads were poor, the rail transport was slow and unreliable, and refrigerated trucks were scarce, leading to massive spoilage of perishable goods like meat, milk, and vegetables before they ever reached the city gastronome. Estimates suggest that between 20% and 40% of the entire Soviet harvest was lost due to this catastrophic logistical failure, a volume of food that could have easily eliminated the chronic deficit. The American system was built on speed, precision, and preservation, treating food as a valuable commodity. The Soviet system treated food as a disposable output, proving that the problem was not production, but distribution. The state was capable of growing food, but structurally incapable of getting it to its people. The contrast is stark. The American farmer's biggest challenge was selling their surplus. The Soviet state's biggest challenge was simply keeping its necessary output from rotting. A colossal, humiliating failure of centralized planning. The political decision to prioritize heavy industry and military spending over consumer well-being and agriculture was the poison pill for the Soviet food system. Every five-year plan allocated massive resources to steel, coal, military hardware, and space exploration, ensuring the Soviet Union remained a global military superpower. But the agriculture and light industry sectors, the parts of the economy that directly touched the daily lives of the citizens, were chronically starved of investment. The money and the best engineers went to building missiles, not refrigerated trucks. The result was a dual economy, a high-tech military complex capable of intercontinental warfare, coexisting with a food system relying on primitive storage and manual labor. The American system, while also having a powerful military, allowed private capital to flow freely into agriculture and consumer goods, creating a thriving, innovative commercial sector that constantly raised the standard of living. The Soviet citizen paid for the state's massive military complex not with taxes, but with empty shelves and low-quality food. The economic cost of the Cold War was internalized and suffered daily by the Soviet population, who had to endure austerity while their government boasted of global power. The American government understood that a happy, well-fed population was key to stability. The Soviet government prioritized ideological control and military parity, leading to a profound, unsustainable disconnect. The state was rich in missiles, but poor in milk, a failure that fundamentally undermined the ideological legitimacy of the entire project. The role of water and infrastructure illustrates the scale of environmental and systemic neglect in Soviet agriculture. The Soviet Union embarked on massive, ambitious, often ecologically disastrous projects to expand farming land, notably through massive irrigation schemes in Central Asia. These projects, while intended to increase grain output for the Central Plan, were implemented with poor scientific oversight and massive waste, leading to large-scale environmental catastrophes, such as the shrinking of the Aral Sea, and producing land that quickly became saline and infertile. The American agricultural system also used irrigation, but it was generally managed by individual farmers or smaller collectives. Driven by efficiency and the preservation of their private asset, the land, the Soviet centralized planning prioritized massive, visible political feats over long-term sustainability, leading to massive, irreversible damage to the very resource they needed, the infrastructure for storing water, preventing erosion, and maintaining soil health was neglected due to the focus on short-term quota fulfillment. Furthermore, the transport infrastructure, the roads and rail links connecting farms to cities, was underdeveloped, forcing massive losses during transport. The American farmer operated within a system of highly developed, private and public infrastructure designed to move goods efficiently. The Soviet farmer operated within a broken system where the political center demanded high output but failed to provide the basic means to move and protect that output. The land, the most crucial component of agriculture, was treated as an expendable resource in service of a political goal. The contrast in diet and nutritional standards reveals the ultimate human cost of the agricultural gap. The American diet, fueled by abundance and efficiency, was rich in protein, variety, and accessible fresh produce year-round. The average American had a diet that was arguably excessive in calories, but certainly diverse in nutrients, offering high-quality meat, dairy, and imported fruits like bananas and citrus. This diversity was taken for granted, the Soviet diet, due to the chronic deficits in meat, dairy, and non-seasonal produce, was heavily reliant on starchy staples, bread, potatoes, and cabbage. While providing basic caloric intake, this diet was often deficient in essential vitamins, high-quality protein, and fats, leading to widespread, low-level nutritional problems that affected public health. The state tried to mask this deficiency by promoting heavily processed sausages, kolbasa, and canned goods, but these were poor substitutes for fresh, high-quality ingredients. This dietary gap was not just a matter of taste. It was a profound difference in the quality of life and public health. The American citizen ate for pleasure and health. The Soviet citizen ate for survival and necessity. The failure of the Soviet agricultural system to provide consistent, diverse nutrition for its massive population was a profound moral failure, proving that a system built on ideological control could not even manage the most basic human imperative, to feed its people well. The state's inability to guarantee high-quality meat and fresh produce was the final, inescapable proof of the economic superiority of the free market, something the state constantly denied. The final, humiliating consequence of the Soviet agricultural failure was the continuous, desperate need for American grain imports. Beginning with the Great Grain Deal in 1972, this was the ultimate moment of economic truth. The Soviet Union, the ideological enemy of the West, was forced to use its precious hard currency, earned from selling oil and gold, to purchase millions of tons of American wheat, corn, and feed grains. This massive, secretive transfer of wealth and resources demonstrated, in the most painful way possible, the total inability of the collective farm system to meet the basic needs of its people. The American farmers, operating their private, efficient businesses, sold their surplus at a massive profit, unwittingly funding the very enemy their government was fighting. The Soviet state spun this as a triumph of détente, a sign of peaceful cooperation, but internally, it was a massive, humiliating admission of failure. The state was essentially bankrupting itself in dollars just to buy the bread that its own massive tracts of fertile land should have produced. This reliance on the capitalist world for basic survival was the most damaging contradiction to the entire communist ideology. The bread that fed the Soviet people was, in reality, American wheat, bought with capitalist money, a truth that exposed the Soviet system as a global parasite, structurally dependent on the efficiency and abundance of the very system it sought to destroy. The queue for bread was not a sign of hard work. It was a symbol of the party's profound failure, paid for by the American farmer. The very structure of the collective farm, Kolkhoz, was a study in economic stagnation and bureaucratic sabotage. The Kolkhoz was ostensibly owned by the collective of its workers, but in reality, it was managed by a rigid hierarchy of state-appointed directors and party officials whose primary loyalty was to Moscow, not to the land or the people working it. These officials often lacked genuine agricultural expertise, their power coming from political connections, leading to disastrous, ideologically driven decisions that ignored local realities. The collective farm worker, the kolkhoznik, lacked the freedom to make independent decisions about planting, harvesting, or selling their output. Every decision was centralized, slow, and often politically motivated, creating massive delays and missed opportunities. The American farmer, being the owner-operator, could make real-time decisions based on weather and market fluctuations, immediately changing crops or selling futures contracts to minimize risk. This flexibility was the capitalist farmer's greatest asset. The Soviet kolkhoz system was characterized by its inflexibility and bureaucracy, forcing farmers to operate years behind the curve. The result was a systemic failure to adapt, innovate, or produce high-quality output. The underlying truth was that the kolkhoz was not designed for economic efficiency. It was designed for political control, a mechanism to ensure that the rural population remained subservient to the central government, preventing the formation of an independent, economically powerful class of free landholders. The price of this political control was paid in chronic food shortages and the degradation of the most fertile lands on Earth. The use of labor in the two systems further highlights the deep ideological and efficiency differences. The American farm utilized highly skilled, well-paid labor combined with massive investment in machinery and automation. The labor was expensive, but the machinery was efficient, resulting in massive output per worker. The entire system aimed to maximize the value of human effort. The Soviet agricultural system, due to chronic underinvestment in machinery and the political need to maintain full employment, was characterized by the inefficient use of labor and the reliance on massive, forced mobilization. During harvest time, the state would routinely pull hundreds of thousands of students, factory workers, and soldiers out of the primary jobs and force them into the field for the campaign. These untrained, resentful temporary laborers were inefficient, damaging machinery, and often contributed to the loss of the harvest. This mobilization was a massive hidden tax on the rest of the Soviet economy, crippling industrial productivity just to save the grain that the state farms, if properly managed and mechanized, should have harvested themselves. The American system viewed human labor as a valuable asset to be leveraged by technology. The Soviet system treated human labor as an expendable, politically manageable resource to be deployed by centralized command. The sight of students manually picking potatoes in the mud was a tragic, common sight in the USSR, an image that spoke volumes about the structural backwardness and the economic cost of ideological rigidity. The issue of storage and infrastructure quality was a perpetual, systemic bottleneck that turned potential Soviet abundance into actual scarcity. The American farm and distribution system utilized vast networks of modern grain silos, temperature-controlled warehouses, and specialized packaging to protect every product from spoilage. This infrastructure was built and maintained because profit depended on it. The Soviet system lacked this essential infrastructure due to the chronic prioritization of heavy industry. Grain was often stored in inadequate, dilapidated warehouses, or sometimes simply left outside, exposed to rain and pests, leading to massive, documented losses of up to 25% of the total harvest. Perishable items suffered even worse, with much of the meat and produce spoiling during the slow, unrefrigerated journey from the Kolkhoz to the city gastronome. The Soviet state never managed to build a proper cold chain, the continuous system of refrigeration necessary to transport and store perishable food. Because the technology and the political will were absent, the result was that food shortages were often not due to a failure to grow the food, but a failure to protect it. The American system was obsessed with minimizing loss, treating waste as an economic failure. The Soviet system accepted waste as a bureaucratic inevitability. The vast amount of food that rotted in the Soviet system was enough to feed millions, but it was lost to the combination of poor roads, unreliable equipment, and the indifference of a system that lacked the financial incentive to care for its own output. The political manipulation of statistics was a fundamental tool used to mask the agricultural crisis from the Soviet public and the world. The Communist Party relied on maintaining the fiction of rising yields and successful quotas to uphold its ideological legitimacy. Farm managers were under immense pressure to report inflated, false harvest figures to the central planners, a phenomenon known as pripiska. This statistical deception created a massive, fictional buffer of grain and produce that existed only on paper, allowing Moscow to boast of abundance while the populace queued for bread. The reality was that the actual usable harvest was far lower, necessitating the secret, humiliating purchase of Western grain to fill the gap. The American agricultural statistics, while subject to market forces, were generally transparent, backed by verifiable private production figures and commodity trading, reflecting the real economic output. The Soviet figures were political documents. Divorced from the harsh reality of the fields, this statistical lie had real-world consequences. Central planners, believing the false reports, would allocate resources incorrectly, exacerbating the problem. the Soviet citizen, seeing the propaganda posters of overflowing fields juxtaposed with the reality of empty stores, developed a profound, justified cynicism toward all state media. The lie about the harvest was perhaps the most damaging of all, because it concerned the most basic element of human survival, proving that the state valued ideological appearance over the truth of its people's well-being. The final, humiliating economic truth was the dependence on the currency of the enemy to secure the nation's food supply. The Great Grain Deal of 1972 and subsequent imports required the Soviet Union to spend massive amounts of US dollars and other hard currency earned primarily from selling oil and gold. This was money that should have been spent on domestic investment, technology, or improving the standard of living, but was instead diverted to pay American farmers to keep the Soviet populace fed. The irony was total. The communist superpower was structurally dependent on the most efficient sector of the capitalist economy, the American farmer's private enterprise. To survive, the non-convertible ruble was worthless on the global commodity market, a final, definitive testament to the ruble's lack of real value, forcing the state to leverage its finite natural resources to buy a product its own ideology claimed to have mastered. This reliance was not just an economic burden. It was a massive political weakness, a silent Achilles heel that exposed the system's structural deficiencies to the highest levels of the party. The bread on the Soviet table was a symbol of ideological defeat, paid for by the enemy's currency and grown by the superior system of private ownership. The failure of the collective farm was the ultimate, inescapable proof that a centrally planned economy could not master even the most basic task of national governance: to reliably and efficiently feed its own people. The ideological distinction between risk, innovation, and stability provide the final, damning economic assessment of the two agricultural models. The American farmer operated in a high-risk, high-reward environment, constantly exposed to market fluctuations, weather disasters, and international competition. The stability of their operation relied on constant innovation, hedging against risk with futures contracts, and aggressive adoption of technology. The reward for this risk was the potential for massive profit and complete control over their business, fueling the relentless efficiency of the U.S. farm sector. The Soviet Kolkhoz system offered the ideological promise of absolute stability, guaranteeing the farmer a job and a basic low wage, insulated from market risks. But the price of this stability was systemic stagnation and the complete elimination of incentive. Why innovate if the profit goes to the state? Why take a risk if failure means political scrutiny? This elimination of risk created an agricultural system that was technologically backward, ecologically unsound, and incapable of responding dynamically to the needs of the population. The American system viewed risk as a necessary catalyst for growth. The Soviet system viewed risk as a political threat to control. The ultimate paradox was that the American high-risk model delivered food security and perpetual surplus, while the Soviet stable model delivered chronic deficit and reliance on foreign aid. The stability promised by the party was merely the stability of the long line and the perpetually empty shelf, a stability purchased at the cost of national nourishment and economic vitality. The political role of the party bureaucracy in crippling the harvest cannot be overstated. The collective farm was not just an economic unit. It was a political unit, subject to constant oversight and interference from local and regional party officials. These officials, driven by political targets and the fear of failing the central plan, often made absurd, detrimental agricultural decisions, overriding the expertise of trained agronomists, forcing planting schedules to meet political deadlines, and demanding grain be harvested prematurely to achieve a propaganda victory. This political interference meant that Soviet agriculture was never truly run by farmers, but by politicians, leading to predictable disasters. The American farmer, while subject to federal regulations, maintained the freedom to implement sound agricultural science and respond rationally to market needs. The decisions were made on the ground by the person whose livelihood depended on the outcome. The Soviet system created a chain of command where political obedience trumped common sense. turning the Kolkhoz into a theater of the absurd, where massive resources were wasted to achieve a lie on paper. The entire chain of command was distorted by the need for pripiska, statistical fraud, ensuring that bad news never traveled up the chain, trapping the central planners in a web of their own making, believing their own false reports of abundance, while the populace went hungry. The lack of political freedom in the Soviet system metastasized into the inability to grow a simple turnip efficiently. The contrast in distribution and processing technology was another hidden fault line. The American system benefited from a dynamic, competitive food processing industry, driven by the need to maximize shelf life, minimize waste, and create attractive, consumer-friendly products. This resulted in advanced canning, freezing, and packaging technologies that ensured quality and convenience. The Soviet food processing industry was primitive, suffering from the same underinvestment and lack of quality control as the rest of the consumer sector. Factories relied on outdated, unreliable equipment, and packaging was often poor, contributing directly to the spoilage problem. The lack of modern feed grain processing and storage was particularly disastrous, forcing the Soviet livestock industry to operate at crippling inefficiency. Massive amounts of imported grain, bought with scarce dollars, were simply wasted or fed inefficiently to the animals, leading to low returns on meat and dairy output. The American farmer's system of processing and distribution was a reflection of the dollar's demand for high-quality, long-lasting products. The Soviet system's failure was a reflection of the ruble's lack of power to demand quality. The consequence was that even the basic act of drinking milk or eating bread was fraught with uncertainty regarding quality and freshness, a constant, low-level reminder of the system's incompetence that no propaganda could erase. The failure to master the cold chain and the processing sector meant that the Soviet economy failed its citizens not once, but multiple times, from the field to the factory to the store. The existence and function of the private farm lobby in the U.S. versus the political control of the Kolkhoz illuminates the democratic difference. The American farmer, through powerful, independent farm lobbies and agricultural associations, had a direct, loud voice in Washington. They could advocate for subsidies, trade policies, and infrastructure investment that directly benefited their private businesses. This was democracy responding to the needs of a vital, independent economic sector. The Soviet Kolkhoznik and farm director had no independent voice. They were represented only by the party, which prioritized its own ideological goals over the material well-being of the farmers. Any genuine criticism of the collective farm system or the central planning bureaucracy was grounds for political investigation and repression, ensuring that the structural failures of the system were never openly discussed or corrected. The American farmer used his political freedom to secure his economic success. The Soviet farmer was stripped of his economic voice to ensure the stability of the party. This suppression of agricultural expertise and economic reality meant that the Soviet food system was constantly fighting against the laws of supply, demand, and basic science. The contrast is stark. The American farm system was self-correcting and politically empowered. The Soviet system was politically rigid and structurally self-destructive, a difference that determined not only the price of bread, but the freedom of speech. This final exploration of the agricultural contrast reveals the deepest truth of the Cold War. The Soviet state, despite its vast territory and ideological claim to global superiority, failed the most basic test of any functioning government: the ability to reliably and efficiently feed its population. The chronic deficit, the massive waste, the reliance on the tiny private plots, and the humiliating dependence on American wheat exposed the centrally planned economy as a structural, irreversible failure. The American farmer, operating in a system of private ownership, free markets, and direct incentive, created a world of perpetual surplus, turning food into an effortlessly available commodity. The Soviet Kolkhoz system, driven by political quotas and bureaucratic fear, created a world of perpetual scarcity, turning the simple loaf of bread into a political weapon and a symbol of state failure. The bread that fed the Soviet people in the 1970s was often American grain, bought with capitalist dollars, the ultimate, inescapable contradiction that defined the twilight of the Soviet Empire. The failure was not of the land, but of the system that controlled it, and the cost was paid by the Soviet citizen in the currency of time, stress, and enduring hunger. What do you think? Was the biggest contradiction of the Soviet system its nuclear arsenal or its crippling dependence on American wheat? Share your thoughts below.